Arab Spring was characterized by a wave of anti-regime, pro-democracy protests that swept across the Middle East and North Africa between 2010 and 2011. Nearly everyone in the West was caught off guard. No one saw it coming. In the aftermath of the financial crisis of 2008, Western analysts failed to see how the converging factors of corruption, lack of economic opportunity, rising inequality, and the corroding effect of living in an authoritarian regime was a ticking time bomb waiting to go off, like dry kindling on the forest floor. And in Tunisia, on December 17th, 2010, that fire was quite literally ignited. Mohamed Bouazizi, a 26-year-old street vendor selling fruit to support his family, lit himself on fire outside a government building to protest local officials who had continually harassed him for bribes and confiscated his merchandise. People identified with Bouazizi's act of martyrdom in protest of the bleak economic conditions and repressive government. 28 days of protests followed and concluded with the overthrow of President Ben Ali's government, fleeing the country on January 14, 2011. Soon after, only 11 days later, on January 25th, Egypt began a revolution of their own. Social media carried the torch and was a source of inspiration for similarly minded young people around the Arabic-speaking world. For the first time, people could organize in online forums, see motivational footage of their Arabic brothers and sisters fighting back and winning against their authoritarian oppressors. Many believed at the time it was the beginning of an inevitable movement that would result in the democratization of the Arab world. And indeed, later that same year, Tunisia, the spark that began it all, drafted a new constitution and held its first democratic elections. The first domino had fallen. The rest would soon follow, right? Yet, 13 years later in 2024, there are no full democracies in the Arab world. In fact, many such as Tunisia have in fact backslid into authoritarianism. The million-dollar question is, of course, why? What's the West not seeing? And why is it so hard for the Arab countries to democratize? Well, I did some research on this very question, and I think I came across some pretty fascinating things. Is the Arab Spring evidence of a persisting Arab identity, or was it simply inspired by other states responding to similar domestic conditions at the time?
In my view, I would argue the latter. As you already mentioned, the global economic recession caused many hardships. On top of that, the growing global economy forced a lot of Arab states to privatize a lot of their previously state-run enterprises in the years prior to the Arab Spring, and actually opened themselves up to a lot of foreign aid.
Really, I didn't know that.
In fact, Jordan, Egypt, Morocco and Tunisia all privatized significant sectors of their economy before the Arab Spring, and the typical train of thought is that economic liberalization, opening of markets, privatization of industries, will lead to economic growth and overall greater economic prosperity.
But that wasn't the case, was it?
No. This is a common fallacy of economics to believe it's a definitive rule that economic liberalization leads to more prosperity. While it may be true on the aggregate for the economy as a whole, in effect it actually worked to increase inequality, making life harder for the poor while increasing the upper class's wealth. It's a common story when foreign aid is given to governments with centralized, authoritarian and often corrupt regimes. Those of us in the West believed pre-Arab Spring that these economic liberalizations would have one of two effects. That these reforms would lead to more support for the authoritarian regimes, because the economy would improve. Or that these reforms would move the needle towards political liberalization.
And we know that, in hindsight, neither of those things happened.
Exactly. Because after the dust had settled on the protests of the Arab Spring, economic prospects didn't improve, even though many of the old governments had been removed from power, and democratization efforts stalled. Ultimately, these assumptions rested on the belief that economic liberalization would inevitably improve the lives of the population, which it did not. It's hard to get people to believe in the promises of democracy when they see no tangible difference in their daily lives. If democracy is so great, then why am I still struggling to put food on the table? It's important to remember that economic liberalization and democratization are not soulmates, they're not inextricably linked. China's proven that. However, China's process of privatization over the last 50 years or so was much more successful than the economies of the Arab world, both before and after the Arab Spring. And ultimately my view, going back to that initial question you asked, is that the uprisings were a response to similar domestic conditions. They were gaining inspiration from success in other states. There existed a common identity, but the protests weren't pan-Arab in nature. They were domestic protests responding to fundamentally domestic issues. It just so happened that they had a lot of those issues in common because of macroeconomic factors at the time.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for taking the time to talk to me. Just to wrap up that point, one quote that I came across in my research that I really like is, "The common enemy of the 2011 Arab Spring protests is not colonialism, U.S. power, or Israel, but Arab's own rulers." And I also think it's worth mentioning how the digital age played a key role here for the spread of information, specifically for young people who were the heartbeat of the movement, and as a way to construct a feeling of online identity, Pan-Arab identity even, through their shared resistance. But interestingly, a lot of that online discussion was very localized to national issues. There was very few truly pan-Arab topics. I came across this research done by a team at Harvard that mapped the topics of the Arabic language blogs right before the Arab Spring in 2009. Each of these dots represents a certain topic that the research team identified, and as you can see, the topics of these blogs remain fairly separated and localized by country. In Egypt, you can see the competing factions between the secular reformists and the Muslim Brotherhood. But again, these topics rarely extend beyond the national level. It's a very useful and fascinating analysis because it shows how the topics of the blogs centered around local issues. There are very few bridges that cross over into truly transnational topics. And tying this back to the overall theme of, is Pan-Arabism still alive? I think what the Arab Spring showed is that the digital age and the commonality of the written Arabic language being able to reach such a wide geographic region was definitely a huge factor that led to the Arab Spring. It allowed for the spread of ideas on a massive scale that had never before been possible in the Arab world until this digital technology was introduced. And I do think there are some common elements of Arab culture that definitely span the entire region, such as a common written language. However, unlike Nasser's ideal of a unified Arab world, this form of Pan-Arabism was more grounded, pragmatic, and above all, this mapping activity shows that the Arab Spring focused on domestic issues. They were getting inspiration from other people who they could identify with on some level, and they were responding to similar issues as them. I think the idea of Pan-Arab unity, or as I'll get into in a second, the idea of using the relative success in one country, such as Tunisia, as a model for the rest of the Arab world falls right back into the generalization of Arab culture that was so flawed in Nasser's ideology. Because ultimately, these states do share some common cultural features, but they are distinct and different in more ways than they appear. One quick example is, anyone who speaks Arabic knows, is that there are many different dialects that are verbally almost mutually incomprehensible. Someone speaking Gulf Arabic will have a very difficult time understanding someone from Morocco, but the written language is universal though, and online, whether through blogs or social media, it can reach a very wide audience. This is just one example of differences between states, and in that realization is a clue for what the West gets wrong about the Arab world. This tendency or desire to generalize and group the region together just because they have similar surface level characteristics. And there's actually a great website that helps us to understand those differences. In the 1970s, Gert Hofstede, sorry if I butchered the pronunciation, he conducted the largest cross-cultural survey ever. It sought to quantify cultural values across different subdimensions that can be universally compared between countries. By breaking it down into separate dimensions, it gives more in-depth and pretty fascinating insights into the cultural values of a country. And for those of you familiar with this theory, there are, albeit, some flaws with the methodology and there's limitations. But irregardless, even when you take the data with a grain of salt, I think it can offer some pretty fascinating insights and is a cool way to quantify and visualize the differences between countries' cultural values. Using Hofstede's data, not as the sole piece of evidence, but in conjunction with other background knowledge, we can compare different Arab countries. The subdimension I will be focusing on specifically is the power distance dimension. Hofstede's Power Distance Index measures the extent to which the less powerful members of organizations and institutions, such as the family, accept and expect power is distributed unequally. This represents inequality, more versus less, but defined from below, not from above. It suggests that a society's level of inequality is endorsed by the followers as much as by the leaders. So let's go to the website here. It's called HofstedeInsights.com, and I'm just going to put in a few different Arab countries. So let's do Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and the US just for comparison's sake. And as you can see, if we zoom into the power distance dimension here, there are some noticeable differences in the power distance dimension between Middle Eastern countries and the US. But within that, there is even a fair amount of variation between the Arab countries. Tunisia and Libya, for instance, they're neighbors, but have pretty different scores. The Libya score in particular really fascinated me because according to the study, They accept an extremely high amount of hierarchy within their society. Furthermore, the definition they used for the power distance score reads as follows. With a very high score of 100, Libya is clearly a hierarchical society. This means that people accept a hierarchical order in which everybody has a place and which needs no further justification. Hierarchy in an organization is seen as reflecting inherent inequalities. Centralization is popular. Subordinates expect to be told what to do, and the ideal boss is a benevolent autocrat. Very interesting. And this tool in general is very useful and interesting because it's a great way to visualize how when culture is quantified, you can more easily see the subtle differences that can be very easy to overlook. It's a really fun tool to play around with, and I encourage you guys to check it out on your own as well. But while there is a degree of variation within these Arab countries, we can still see that in general, compared to the US for example, the power distance scores of all the Arab countries are significantly higher. And when you take this in conjunction with the individualism dimension, we can get a pretty accurate picture of what a country's cultural values are. A high power distance and collectivist culture means you expect power to be distributed unequally and for things to be centralized. Whereas conversely, a low power distance and individualist culture means you expect a more egalitarian society and for your individual opinion to matter. Basically, the Western liberal tradition of democracy. And for those of you familiar with Arabic culture, you know that it is a very patriarchal, family-first society where everything you do is going to reflect on your family and your family's name. This is obviously very different from many Western cultures and can explain the difference in the scores in the individualism dimension. This is so interesting to me that where in many cases countries have a long-standing history of authoritarian regimes, such as in the Arab world and broader Middle East, they have higher power distance scores, as well as lower individualism scores. Essentially, they are more accustomed to believing that inequality, the power distance dimension, is a fact of life, that power is distributed unequally, and that their individual opinion is not as important as the larger group. This from the collectivist dimension. Conversely, a lot of democracies have lower power distance scores, meaning they tend to believe more in equality and that no one person in a society should be more powerful than anyone else. I think this can explain some of the misconceptions many in the West have about the Middle East. We're approaching the question of why is it so hard for countries in the Middle East to democratize from a fundamentally flawed perspective, because we're coming at it with our own preconceived biases, without even realizing it. As these scores indicate, democracy is not an irrefutable fact of life. It is a cultural construction derived from the liberal humanist tradition that has pervaded Western societies over the last few centuries. But before that, most humans in the history of the world lived in authoritarian, repressive regimes. And this lack of cultural understanding can explain why scholars failed to forecast the Arab Spring, and why it's been so hard for Arab countries to successfully democratize. Now, I know you might be thinking, this could be seen as a chicken and the egg type debate. Correlation does not imply causation, and that it's very possible that the type of government leads to a citizen's cultural beliefs, from the top down rather than from the bottom up, where the culture affects the government. And this is a very solid critique of this argument, but we have to remember that data is a tool, something to be used in conjunction with the other background knowledge and qualitative data that we have. And in fact, there is a lot of evidence that supports this argument that some cultures are not as accustomed to democracy. Take Tunisia and Egypt, for example. In the first Tunisian election, there was a low voter turnout, only 48% of the eligible population. In addition, both in Tunisia and Egypt, there has been continued significant opposition from religious fundamentalist groups, primarily the Muslim Brotherhood, along with other radical Islamists, that inevitably led to both countries never fulfilling their democratic aspirations. Even in the democratic elections in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood Party won 47% of the seats in the first parliamentary elections following the Arab Spring, with the total number of Islamist groups holding seats in parliament at 72%. There is no denying that these groups have significant bases of political support in these countries, and such radical factions often oppose the ideals of democracy, which is what led to Tunisia's ultimate authoritarian takeover in 2021. No matter how much the younger, more progressive generation wants to democratize and modernize, it will be difficult when there is not a history of democracy and with factions like these having such strong political support. That is the challenge of governing in a democracy. All groups are given a voice, and sometimes those groups don't really believe in democratic ideals. Another great example is Kuwait. While albeit a small country, they've been able to maintain stability for a long period of time with very limited democracy. Their regime, a ruling family that goes back over 2 centuries, has maintained political stability through a hybrid regime where the ruling family effectively has all the power. They handpick the cabinet and the prime minister who work to create legislation. but they are considered a limited democracy because there is a 50-seat parliament democratically elected by the people. Except the parliament actually has very limited political power. While they can move for votes of no confidence to try to remove the prime minister,
I move for a vote of no confidence in Chancellor Valorum's leadership.
as well as veto legislation. However, at any moment the ruling family can call for a dissolution of the parliament and trigger new elections. It is not fully democratic by any means. But it's fascinating to see how they've been able to use limited civic participation that seems to have created long-term stability. And this evidence, in conjunction with the Hofstede country comparison we looked at, I believe does provide a pretty strong argument that maybe we are forcing our cultural values onto Arab countries. We should consider the possibility that maybe democracy isn't an inherent value we can just export like a commodity. Even in many long-standing democracies of the West today, it took time for cultural opinions to change and for widespread adoption. Furthermore, there are many exceptions to the rule, and it is important to remember not to overgeneralize. Just because democracy may not be compatible in Egypt right now does not mean that is the case across the Arab world, or that it won't be the case in the future. One need only to look at how culturally different Lebanon is from Egypt, or the different political systems of the Gulf monarchies to understand this point. We must remember that democracy, and human culture in general, are constructs. Even national identities are constructed. Arab identity was born out of the early Muslim empire that conquered much of the Middle East and North Africa in the 8th century. But before that, it was Egyptians, Berbers, Syrians, who all had their own unique languages, cultures, and religion. Yet over time, they were assimilated into the empire and they were both accepted and began to think of themselves as Arab. This is how culture works. It changes and adapts over time. And the longer cultural norms and values persist, the more resistant they become. For instance, did you know that the current political system in the Middle East of unique political entities and borders has not existed in nearly 3,000 years? From the Ottomans to the Moors all the way back to the Neo-Assyrians in the 8th century BC, the Middle East has constantly been changing hands between different empires. While this distant history may seem unrelated to current-day politics, it is in fact crucial context in understanding how deeply rooted hierarchy and power is as cultural norms. And taking all this information, the millennia of imperial rule, the cultural dimension scores we looked at, the repeated opposition to democratization efforts post-Arab Spring, as well as the legacy of Pan-Arabism, can give context to why the Arab Spring happened. Because even though Arab identity may be a construct, this does not mean it has no real-world political power. Nasser proved that. And while Nasser's version of Pan-Arabism is dead, you can still see echoes of his legacy. However, the movement has evolved into something more realistic. Primarily because it does not overlook the very significant differences that exist among the Arab countries. Perhaps the Arab Spring was growing pains, when the old ideas and the new inevitably came into conflict. Yet ultimately, it was evidence that there is still an underlying Arab identity. And maybe this is the hope for the future, for a more cooperative Arab region that utilizes its cultural similarities, while also recognizing the distinct differences between countries.